This is an audio review for Chapter 17, Introduction to Sociology, Introduction to Government and Politics. So sociology is looking at government and politics through the context of power and authority. So sociologists have a distinctive approach to studying governmental power and authority that differs from perspectives of other disciplines such as political science. Sociologists tend to be more interested in the influences of governmental power on society and in how social conflicts can arise from the distribution of power. Sociologists also examine how the use of power affects local, state, national, and global agendas, which in turn affect people differently based on status, right? Those different identities we've talked about, such as socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, etc. So what is power? Many different scholars have really tried to grapple with this idea, right? So oftentimes when we talk about power, we're looking at it from a perspective of Max Weber, a conflict theorist, who said that power is the ability to exercise one's will over others. Power affects more than personal relationships. It shapes larger dynamics like social groups, professional organizations, and governments themselves. Similarly, government's power is not necessarily limited to control of its citizens. A dominant nation, for example, will often use its clout or influence to support other governments or to seize control of other nation-states. Efforts to gain power and influence don't necessarily lead to violence, exploitation, or abuse. They can be positive. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. commanded powerful movements that affected positive change without bloodshed, without military force. MLK organized nonviolent protests to combat corruption and injustice, and was successful in inspiring major reforms. So these kind of movements rely on a variety of nonviolent protest strategies, such as rallies, sit-ins, marches, petitions, and boycotts. So there's a lot of different ways to understand how power operates and who wields that power. So different types of authority is another important concept to explore. Authority refers to accepted power. That is, the power that people agree to follow. People listen to authority figures because they feel that these people are worthy of respect. And generally speaking, people perceive the objectives and demands of authority figures as reasonable or good or true. So there's different kinds of authority. You have traditional, charismatic, and legal rational. So traditional authority, according to Weber, the power of traditional authority is accepted because it's been the case traditionally. So the legitimacy that comes from that is really just because it's been accepted for a long time, right? So, the former queen in Britain, now her son the king, right, occupies that position based on traditional rules of succession for the monarchy. And people adhere to traditional authority because they're invested in the past and feel obligated to perpetuate those systems into the future. So typically, in this type of authority, a ruler has no real force to carry out their will or position. It depends primarily on the rest of society respecting that position. A more modern form of traditional authority is patrimonialism, which is the traditional domination facilitated by an administration and military that are purely personal instruments of the person in power, the master. So in this form of authority, all officials are there in power because they've been appointed by that ruler for, basically they're like their cronies. So those officials don't necessarily have rights because at any point they can just be taken away at the whims of that leader. Charismatic authority is a little bit different. So followers accept the power of charismatic authority because they're drawn to that individual or to the personal qualities of that leader. The appeal of a charismatic leader is, that they basically inspire people to follow them, that people will change their lives or, even go into some sort of peril to, follow the lead of that particular leader. So charismatic leaders usually emerge in times of crisis, and they offer innovative or radical solutions. So there's many positive charismatic leaders throughout time, right? And then there's a lot of tyrannical, awful charismatic leaders, right? Because sometimes what people want to hear can be scapegoating, can be blaming people for their problems, right? Such as Hitler. His rise to power was in the post-war economic depression of Germany. And basically Germany had been destroyed by World War I. And there was this kind of notion that, people wanted to bring back that kind of power and status that Germany held before the First World War. And so someone like Hitler being able to blame poor people and the Roma and the disabled and homosexuals and of course the Jewish people, and to actually take them out of society, put them into ghettos, force them into forced labor and concentration camps, and literally murder millions of people. Throughout that process, the kind of charisma of the only reason you have problems is because of these people really motivated a lot of people to follow that ideology, right? So what's interesting though is charismatic leaders often only hold power for short periods of time, and that they're just as likely to be tyrannical as they are heroic. So if you think of, the examples in the book range quite a spectrum of, again, tyrannical to heroic, such as Hitler, Napoleon, Jesus Christ would be an example of a charismatic leader, right? People kind of giving up their lives to follow around some dude in sandals. Cesar Chavez, right, who really organized farm workers and brought a lot of rights and attention to the issues that they face. Malcolm X, or even someone like Winston Churchill, right? They're all charismatic leaders. And then according to Weber, power is made legitimate by laws, written rules, and regulations, and this is termed rational legal authority. In this type of authority, power is vested in a particular rationale, system, or ideology, and not necessarily in a person who implements that doctrine. So a nation that follows a constitution applies this type of authority, right? Basically, you follow the laws instead of following what a person says. On a smaller scale, you might encounter rational legal authority in the workplace, such as the kind of instructions of what's going on in your employee handbook, what's expected, and the authority that reinforces or basically enforces that legal sense is your boss. Okay, so looking at different forms of government. So first, anarchy is the absence of organized government. The definition in the textbook is very limited and not accurate at all. So I'm going to play you a clip of Noam Chomsky. I put this in the additional resources for you. I would add it in this video, but copyright, blah, 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 I'm not allowed to. So anyway, Noam Chomsky himself, if you've never heard of him, I'm sorry, but also you're welcome. He's the foremost linguist of the 20th and 21st century. He has, other than being the most notable linguist, on his side, just in his spare time, he's written hundreds of books about politics and history, and he himself is an anarchist. And the video I provided in the additional resources, in just 7 minutes, he succinctly explains the viewpoint of anarchism much better than that in the book. So please watch that as well. I put it in here, but copyright. Okay, so monarchy is a government in which a single person or a monarch rules until they abdicate the throne. So typically you get this because you were born, right? Hereditary succession. So your mom was the queen, then guess what? You get to be the king now. That's kind of what happened in Britain. So, monarchies of most modern nations, though, are ceremonial, right? So when you think about the Queen of England, she wasn't really making all of the legislative decisions. That was Parliament. But they are, these kind of aristocratic figureheads that do have an impact on policy in some ways because they do influence those elected leaders. But it's pretty much ceremonial, right? There's different kinds of monarchies as well. So a few nations today are run by governments where a monarch has absolute or unmitigated power, right? And there's a few of these examples. It's usually problematic. Just spoiler. Any situation where one person has power of an entire nation, kind of problematic. So one example would be Saudi Arabia. They have very large oil holdings, so we tend to look the other way about the human rights abuses that take place in Saudi Arabia, such as by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who had this huge mass execution in, I'm trying to remember if it was 2021 or 2022, held a huge mass execution just to basically show the international community can't do anything about it because they need his oil. So just kind of an absolute display of power, which again is pretty terrible, especially because a lot of those people being executed, their crimes were like they spoke up against him. And then you have constitutional monarchies. In today's global political climate, these are far more likely to happen, right? So they have a monarchy, but it has to abide by the laws of a greater constitution, right? So kind of that same thing of Great Britain, Canada, they have actual prime ministers whose leadership role is much more, actually involved in the day-to-day politics than the monarchs themselves, but the monarchs is still there. And then you have oligarchies. So the power in an oligarchy is held by a small elite group. Unlike in a monarchy, members of an oligarchy don't necessarily achieve their status based on ties to noble birth, but they basically get there because of either military, economic power, or other similar circumstances. So the term oligarchy itself can be kind of confusing. Rarely does a society openly define itself as an oligarchy, because obviously it carries a negative connotation. People don't like to say, oh, my government's a corrupt group of elites that control everything, right? That make unfair policy decisions to maintain their own power. But many modern nations that claim to be democracies are actually oligarchies, in fact. So some prominent journalists like Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Laureate Prize in Economics, have labeled the United States an oligarchy, pointing to the influence of large corporations and Wall Street executives on U.S. policymaking. Other political analysts assert that all democracies are really just elected oligarchies, or systems in which citizens must vote for an individual who's part of a pool of candidates that often come from the most elite ruling class in society. So oligarchies have existed throughout history, and today many consider Russia a clear example of an oligarchic political structure. After the fall of communism, groups of business owners captured control of Russia's natural resources, and they used that opportunity to expand their own wealth and political influence. So once oligarchic power has been established, it's very difficult for lower and middle class citizens to advance their own socioeconomic status because, again, the whole scale is tilted in the favor of the rich. So the question becomes, is the US an oligarchy? I included in your additional resources 2 videos to this point. One that really defines what oligarchies are by Robert Reich, the former labor secretary. And then another basically interview with Bernie Sanders talking about how he worries that America is becoming an oligarchy. So when you look back in the past, in the American Gilded Age, we saw the rise and dominance of ultra-rich families, such as the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the wealth that they had was absurd, right? So at the same time, though, while they had so much wealth, so many people were barely surviving, right? Living below what's considered the poverty level. So some scholars believe the United States is now embarked on a second Gilded Age, pointing out that the 400 wealthiest American families now own more than the lower 150 million Americans put together. The top 10% of earners took in more than half the country's wealth, and the highest proportion recorded in a century of government record keeping. So just showing that, and this is actually the figure they have in the book is coming from 2012, and it's so much worse now than it was in 2012. Spoiler! So many of the super rich can then use that power, that money, that influence, that economic clout to purchase more than just like yachts and big houses and luxury stuff like that. They can purchase, not just, the corporate leaders themselves, they can purchase political donors or politicians themselves. So based on campaign finance reform legislation in 1971 and 2002, political campaign contributions used to be regulated and limited. But the 2012 Supreme Court decision in the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission repealed a lot of the restrictions on campaign finance. So the court ruled that contributions of corporations and unions to political action committees are a form of free speech that cannot be abridged. All right, let me back that up a little bit. Basically, this ruling said corporations are people, which they're not, because they're not alive and they can't be jailed and they can't die. But anyway, so that's already a hop, skip, and a jump from reality. Corporations are people. But then on top of that, they said, since corporations are people and they don't have mouths with which to have free speech equals unlimited amounts of money in the political system. So obviously opponents to this new, to that Supreme Court decision in 2012, say that this promotes oligarchy. The ultra wealthy can then pour as much money as they want into politics and oftentimes really affect, election cycles. I know it's an intro class, and in the purpose of trying to keep these audios brief, I try not to go off a little bit, but I feel like you should know this. Citizens United, the history of that's pretty interesting. So Citizens United started as a group to defend Clarence Thomas. So Clarence Thomas is a Supreme Court justice who, when he was nominated, revelations came to light that Anita Hill, and then later other workers for him as well, were being sexually harassed by Clarence Thomas. And the stuff that he did was grotesque and over the top. I mean, stuff that we clearly would define today as sexual harassment, such as talking about the pornography he liked, referring to himself as Long Dong Silver, just stuff that's like gross and disgusting and I don't like to repeat, but this is reality. So what happened was, at the time he was nominated to the all-male panel in the Senate, there was this backlash by women in Congress that said, you need to listen to Anita Hill and hear what she has to say about her experience under this man's leadership and how problematic he would be as a judge who then gets to sit on the Supreme Court for life. So Anita Hill hearings became a circus sideshow where they claimed that somehow she was just a scorned woman that had an axe to grind with powerful black men. And where did that narrative come from? In attack ads from a group called Citizens United, right? So basically Citizens United put a bunch of attack ads on the air, and Anita Hill was basically ignored and also belittled and terribly, terribly, degraded by those hearings in Congress. There's a great documentary on Netflix called Anita to hear more about this issue. So anyway, fast forward to the 2010s. Hillary Clinton's running for president, and this group, Citizens United, made a film basically saying that the Clinton family just kills everybody. Fun fact, the Clintons are old, right? And once you hit about 60 or 70, a lot of the people are dead. Let's just be honest. I'm not even close to 60 or 70, and yet I know a lot of people who are dead. So this film basically said all those people were dead because they killed them. Right? And so it's just basically like a huge, long political attack ad in the form of a film. And so it violated the campaign finance, rules at the time. And it made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And guess who got to be the deciding vote in that case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission? Clarence Thomas, the guy that they got on the bench in the first place, 30 years earlier. So it's a fun history about Citizens United that I think is important for people to understand just how incredibly corrupt it is. That corporations are now considered people, and that because they're people, they need free speech and elections, which means unlimited amounts of money. And so this also has given rise to not just political action committees, but what they call super PACs, which are basically dark money sites where you can donate any amount of money, but because supposedly they run separate of the candidate themselves, they don't fall under those same campaign finance rules. So, we basically estimate that millions of dollars that are coming into each cycle might even be coming from other countries or from foreign interests, because there's no way to actually track who gave this money and where it came from. That's incredibly problematic in a democracy, right? So again, I know it's an intro class, we don't get into all that. So watch the videos I put in the additional resources, and just know that Citizens United is a wild ruling. Okay, moving on to different forms of government. Dictatorship. So the power in a dictatorship is held by a single person or sometimes a small group of people that wield complete and absolute authority over a government and population. Dictatorships may be corrupt and seek to limit or even eradicate the liberties of the general population. Dictators use a variety of means to perpetuate their authority. Economic and military might, as well as intimidation and brutality, right? Like jailing people, disappearing people. These are foremost among their tactics. And so obviously individuals are much more likely or less likely to rebel if they're starving, if they're fearful. So many dictators start out as military leaders who are conditioned to the use of violence. And those dictators possess some of those personal appeal that Weber was talking about, identified with charismatic leadership, right? So that leader might have an authority or, basically kind of a charismatic authority that lends to that power. So the late Kim Jong-il, the North Korean dictator, and his successor, Kim Jong-un, his son, exemplify that type of charismatic dictatorship. And then totalitarian dictatorships are those that don't align themselves with any particular belief system or ideology. The goal is just to preserve the authority of the dictator, is even more oppressive, and attempts to control all aspects of a subject's life, including their occupation, their religious beliefs, how many children they're allowed to have, and citizens could be forced to publicly demonstrate their faith in the regime. So very hopefully different than a dictatorship is a democracy. Right? Democracy is a form of government that strives to provide everyone with an equal voice or an equal vote to determine policy regardless of who they are or their economic status or any other social status. An important fundamental issue of democratic state is the establishment of a government and comprehensive constitution that delineates the roles and responsibilities of leadership and the citizens themselves. So basically, there's a rule of law that's adhered to instead of just listening to what a person says. Although the United States champions the democratic ideology, it's not actually a pure democracy. In a purely democratic society, all citizens would vote on proposed legislation, but that's just not how it works in the US. We have what's called a representative democracy, right? And this is basically where we elect representatives to promote policies that favor our interests. So in the US, the representatives are elected at local and state levels, and the votes of the Electoral College, unfortunately, determine who holds the office of president. That's a whole nother thing we could get into. So each of the three branches of government, the executive, judicial, and legislative, is supposedly held in check by the other branches. And the idea is it all works out unless it becomes an oligarchy where the representatives are just bought by those corporations or wealthy interests to do their bidding instead of the citizens' bidding. So that's a good segue into politics in the United States. Sociology studies politics as a means to understand the underlying social norms and values of a group. A society's political structure and practices provide insight into the distribution of power and wealth, as well as larger philosophical and cultural beliefs. A cursory sociological analysis of U.S. politics would suggest that Americans' desire to promote equality and democracy on a theoretical level is really at odds with the nation's capitalistic orientation, right? Because capitalism's like me, and democracy's like we. Voter participation is essential to the success of the U.S. political system. Although many Americans are quick to complain about laws and leadership, only about half the population that's eligible to vote actually votes. It's a fun fact that the biggest political party in the United States are just people who don't vote or have any political party affiliation. Part of this is due to apathy, right? Just like feeling like my vote doesn't matter, right? But really the bigger part that we really need to grapple with, especially sociologists that we examine, is voter suppression. So felony disenfranchisement, where basically you get a felony and then you can't vote anymore, as well as many other issues, such as voter ID laws, can make it really hard for marginalized groups to vote. And again, I put a video in your additional resources about this from Vice called Voter Suppression, It's the American Way. And it explores some of these issues, such as, the interstate cross-check program that was implemented in many states that knocked hundreds of thousands of eligible voters off the rolls because supposedly they voted in two states because they have their first and last name were the same as someone else in another state. But they don't actually use someone's social security number, their date of birth, or other identifiable markers, just their name. In other ways, you have gerrymandering, which basically is a system where the elected officials choose their voters so that they can retain power. Social inequalities also impact politics in the United States. Whether it's race, gender, or social class, there's a lot of issues of inequities because of our political system, or even due to the government, its laws, how it distributes resources, all sorts of stuff. So in the book, they talk about the importance of the Voting Rights Act, the fact that, the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1964 really solidified the idea that everyone's vote should count. And before this, there were really unequal distributions of people in many areas that, even though they technically legally should have been able to vote, were not able to vote, were targeted, and oftentimes using techniques like poll taxes, literacy tests, things like this, to try to keep communities of color away from voting. So it was an important landmark decision, the Voting Rights Act being passed into law. But unfortunately, in June of 2013, the Supreme Court repealed several important aspects of the Voting Rights Act, and they ruled that Southern states no longer need the stricter scrutiny that used to be required to prohibit racial discrimination voting practices in the South. So basically what that means is because those states had a history of racial discrimination when it came to voting practices, if they wanted to change their voting laws, it had to be outside of that state, kind of go through a scrutiny or review to make sure that the changes to the law were not going to discriminate or otherwise impact marginalized communities. But that was struck down in 2013. The overwhelmingly white Supreme Court thought, hey, you know what? Racism's over. We don't really need those protections of the Voting Rights Act. And as soon as that decision was made in 2013, several states have now moved forward with voter ID laws that was previously banned by federal courts because of the ways in which they can really impact marginalized communities in very inequitable ways. When it comes to gender, obviously the fact that women were not able to vote until 1920, and really a lot of women of color were not actually able to exercise that right until often the 1960s after the Voting Rights Act, this really shows that gender affects who is considered, able to cast a vote, and really who we think deserves to have public office. So women are underrepresented in politics, and if we keep going on track where we are, how we are with the inequities within, especially the highest levels of power, when you look at more local offices, statewide offices, the smaller scale politics, there are more women involved in this. But the higher you go, the more powerful the political positions, the less likely women are to be seen in them. And of course, we're one of those few industrialized countries that's never had a woman actually at the full seat of power as president. In many ways, this comes back down to our perceptions of gender roles and who does what task, right? When we talk about gender, the expectation that women are submissive and nurturing and that men are much more outgoing and have much more leadership potential, this bias that we've learned from society affects how we then interpret candidates when they run for office, right? If a woman strives to gain power, is very strong, is assertive, is knowledgeable, sometimes we don't take that very well, even though the same qualities in a male candidate might be attractive to us, largely because it challenges some of our kind of gender perceptions in society. And then, of course, when looking at social class, the overwhelming majority of elected officials in Congress are millionaires, right? People that have much more money than the average person. It costs a lot to run for office, and it's very cost prohibitive, meaning, if you or I decides, I want to run for Congress, it's going to be very difficult to break into those systems. That's why you had groups like Emily's List that, were trying to funnel money to progressive female candidates that supported abortion rights in a time period when women trying to run against male incumbents is very difficult. Politics is complicated though, and obviously incumbency is a big part of it. When you already know someone's name and have that recognition, they're more likely to get, reelected. But money is a large part of how politics runs. And again, ever since that Citizens United Supreme Court decision, money, unlimited amounts of money is what's being poured into the political system. So the fact that, poor people aren't really going to be able to have that access to those resources to, fundraise and campaign for those big money donors in the same way that rich people are, means that, their likelihood of attaining office is much lower. And then, of course, because these elected officials are very wealthy and powerful, just their day-to-day lived experience might be very different than some of their constituents. So how well they can actually represent those communities comes into question because they don't have those same issues. They don't have those same struggles that a lot of their poor constituents have. And then just briefly looking at the judicial system. This is the third branch of government that consists of local, state, and federal courts. So the U.S. Supreme Court is the highest court in the land and has final say on decisions about the constitutionality of laws that citizens are challenging. So some rulings have a direct impact on the political system, such as getting rid of the Voting Rights Act and making it so people can put up voter ID laws that often can disenfranchise a lot of voters. And of course, those campaign finance rules that have changed. But other Supreme Court decisions can affect different aspects of society. And they're really useful for sociological study because they help us understand cultural changes. So again, another recent example would be those legal work protections for lesbian, gay, and bisexual workers so that they can't be fired for their sexual identity. And then, of course, the challenge against Roe v. Wade and the overturning of Roe v. Wade that takes away the constitutional right of a woman to control her own body and have autonomy as to basically to control her destiny, whether or not she has children. Almost 50 years of precedent was overturned in a day. Many states had trigger bans that went into effect that immediately took away these rights completely. And then, of course, several states have followed with more restrictive laws as well. And now, some politicians are really making the move to try to make sure that this happens across the United States, that regardless of what state you live in, as a woman, you will not have, or really not just women, but anyone of reproductive capacity will not have control over their own bodies in order to decide with themselves, with their families, with their doctor, what is the best course of action for their pregnancy and their lives. And this is really wild because you have politicians, especially the politicians that believe in small government, being like, you have to have a baby. That's a pretty strong overreach of the government, right? Kind of goes a little bit closer to that totalitarian idea of controlling every aspect of citizens' lives. When you can control whether or not people have children, that's a big step of a government. So anyway, I'd love to get into it more, but instead I put a video in your additional resources that talks about how do these issues actually have an impact, not just on women, but a compounding issue, especially for poor women of color that face higher maternal mortality issues. And therefore, this ruling could actually end up being a death sentence for many women in America. Okay, so looking at different theoretical perspectives on government and power. So functionalism. First up, according to functionalists, the government has four main purposes. The first one is planning and directing society. The second one is meeting social needs. The third one is maintaining law and order. And the fourth is managing international relations. According to functionalists, all aspects of society form or serve some sort of purpose. So functionalists view government and politics as a way to enforce our norms and regulate any conflicts that we have in society. Functionalists often see active social change, such as, challenging the status quo, whether it be standing up against corporate greed, civil rights actions, right? Things like that, like Black Lives Matter. Functionalists often see social change as undesirable because it's forcing change. And the idea is that they're worried. They like to have static society, which is kind of inherently a problem because society is not static. It changes, right? So functionalists want, if each institution's connected to each other, like pieces of a puzzle, each time one changes, it has ripple effects and affects the others, right? So in a way, they think that there's a kind of dysfunction that happens when you change those social forces. So they seek consensus and order in society, and they argue that dysfunction will create social problems. And so it's ironic, though, the social problems themselves then lead to social change, right? So if, you have much more corporate greed and, issues of people being able to vote, then that's going to cause social movements that push back, that try to gain those rights. So they're actually, the dysfunction creates a social problem that then leads to the social change that they have a problem with. So anyway, functionalists would see monetary political contributions as a way of keeping people connected to the democratic process, meaning they'd say, well, yeah, you give your $25 to a candidate, I give my $25 to a candidate, it's plurality, we're all contributing to the political system, bada boom, bada bing. But this is very different for conflict theorists, who would see financial contributions as a real way for the rich to perpetuate their own wealth. Because if, like the Koch brothers in the last, what was that? Oh, was that 2016? Oh, my brain. In 2016, they pledged, before they even knew that Donald Trump would be the candidate, before anyone had been formally nominated, they pledged $880 million to the RNC to whoever became the candidate. So the idea that just a couple, billionaire brothers that were oil and gas industry guys could then put over $800 million into that process. Think about it this way. If I give a candidate $25 and you give them $800 million, who are they more beholden to? Who are they going to take a meeting with? And actually, it's so funny. Trump actually said this because you know how he likes to just kind of shoot from the hip. And he said when he was running in 2016 that he gives to all political candidates because when he wants something, he'll get on the phone with them and say, hey, I gave you this many millions of dollars. Now you're going to listen to me and you're going to create better legislation that benefits me. So conflict theorists say, the social inequalities and power differences within society affect the way that we then have to understand politics. So of course, Karl Marx is a big part of conflict theory perspective. And he viewed social structure rather than individual characteristics or personality characteristics as the cause of many social problems, such as poverty and crime. So Marx believes that conflict between groups struggling to attain wealth and power or keep their wealth and power that they already have is inevitable in a capitalistic society. So conflict is the only way for the underprivileged to eventually gain some measure of equality. And of course, he said that you do that by basically gaining or throwing off your class consciousness, your false consciousness that says, I want to be like the rich people and I want to support the world that they promote, and instead have class consciousness, which is realizing how much you're getting screwed by the elites and coming together with many other people that are also in many other ways, being downtrodden and striving for equity and for your own rights. So building on that conflict theory perspective is C. Wright Mills, who coined the phrase power elite to describe what he saw as a small group of people who control much of society. So Mills believed that the power elite use government to develop social policies that allow them to keep their wealth. So for example, the tax cuts in 2017, which has resulted in the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in American history. You have hundreds of corporations, as we discussed previously, that paid $0 in taxes ever since. All the ones you've heard of. Sprint, Coca-Cola, all the airlines, all of the big companies, Apple, Starbucks, that make billions of dollars in revenue because of these tax loopholes. They're able to basically circumvent having to pay any of that money at all. And none of that money then comes back into the system and enriches all of those things that make our society work, right? Such as roads, schools, things like that we have to pay for to keep society running. And to build on that too, William Domhoff basically talks about how the power elite can really be seen as a subculture because they follow real social patterns, like they join elite clubs, they attend very select schools, like the very select Ivy Leagues, and even in the Ivy Leagues, they're in those secret societies like the Skull and Bones and all that kind of stuff. And they vacation at the same places, like a handful of exclusive destinations that poor folks can't get into. So in this way, they rub shoulders with each other, their kids marry each other, and they consolidate more and more power. And part of the whole idea of the power elite was, it's the people that are at the top of the corporate America, the people that are at the top of the government, and the people that are at the top of the military institutions, that those people really get to make the majority of the decisions that affect all of our lives, but we're talking about a handful of people. And it's an actual interesting idea too, that it's kind of a revolving door, that some people start off in politics and end up in corporations. Some people are CEOs first, like, Dick Cheney, right? He was a CEO of Halliburton. And then when he was vice president, Halliburton was given a no-bid contract to develop, oil wells in Iraq. And obvious conflict of interest, right? But the idea there is that, you have people that are like pharmaceutical reps, they become politicians, and then they end up back on those boards of pharmaceutical companies or vice versa. You even have people who work at organizations like the EPA that literally try to gut aspects of the EPA and then end up back, as on the board of or CEOs of oil and gas companies. So using this kind of lens that C. Wright Mills and later Domhoff expanded on, we can see in which the way that these very small cabal of folks have a lot of power, and in that case they're able to really exercise that power. And then symbolic interactionism, all the other ones are looking more macro, but symbolic interactionism is really, again, looking at how we make meanings through interaction. And so typically there we're looking at like Weber and Mead. So they're looking at emblems, symbols, figures, and individuals that represent power and authority. And so, for example, they talk about images that represent power and authority in the US. So like the White House, I think that's why like every dystopian film, like every time like the aliens come, they blow up the White House, right? Because it's supposed to be the symbol of power. Another one could be like the bald eagle or an American flag. Those things don't inherently mean anything. Their meaning comes from us and the meanings that we apply to them. So symbolic interactionists aren't really interested in the large structures of the government. They're micro-sociologists. So they're more interested in the face-to-face aspects of politics itself, because in reality, much of politics is face-to-face backroom meetings and lobbying, right? People that show up, give you a crap ton of money and say, hey, listen to me, and, basically take this money I gave you and consider changing the law to something that favors my group. And sometimes these things can be advocacy organizations like, I don't know, the Sierra Club, right? You give your $20 and they send a lobbyist to Congress to make sure that they try to enact policies that are more, effective on climate change. But then you also have a lot of lobbying done by corporate interests, right? So you have, for example, Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical wing, right? These representatives, they have several lobbyists per member of Congress. So the amount of money, the amount of, buying people lavish dinners and sending them on vacations and doing all of these things, these aspects of lobbying, is really to try to grease the wheels and make sure that the policies that they want to enact are what are enacted. So what the public often sees is like the front porch of politics that's sanitized by the media through gatekeeping, when in reality, in those back rooms, that's where all the nitty-gritty is going down. And again, if this wasn't an intro lecture, I'd go into ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and how this was basically an organization that was funneling money from corporations and ideas from corporations, and then handing them to lawmakers and saying, here's the legislation, you just put your name on it and insert the name of your state in there. There's a great Last Week Tonight looking at the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. They've changed their name at this point because they had such bad publicity. But still, that's another example of how this kind of stuff works and something that symbolic interactionists would really be looking at. So symbolic interactionists are most interested in the interactions between small groups who make decisions. Or like in the case of some congressional committees, those that demonstrate the inability to make any decisions of any kind. So the heart of politics is the result of interactions between individuals and small groups over periods of time. And these meetings together can then produce new meanings and new perspectives that we then use to make sure that there's future interactions. So symbolic interactionists are just looking at this in a much more micro approach versus functionalism and conflict theory.